At midnight in Brussels, Donald Trump stunned NATO by demanding full sanctions on China. Hours later, Beijing hit back with a $50 billion trade shock against Mexico, slamming car sales, steel shipments, and farm exports in one strike. Dealers shut down showrooms, farmers fear collapse, and Europe braces for chaos. The question is now chilling. Has Washington cornered China or just set fire to its own power? Midnight falls in Brussels, but inside NATO headquarters, the atmosphere is anything but calm. Donald Trump pounds the table and demands that Europe join America in sanctioning China. His argument is blunt. Without cutting Beijing, Russia's war machine will never stop. He points to numbers showing that India was the second largest purchaser of Russian fossil fuels in April, with Russian crude accounting for about 40% of their total imports. For Washington, the message is clear: sanction China or risk fueling Moscow. But across the room, European leaders exchange nervous looks. They know the EU's trade deficit with China in 2024 was about €304.5 billion. German factories rely heavily on Chinese battery imports to keep electric cars moving. French supermarkets depend on cheap consumer goods shipped directly from Shanghai. If those supply lines break, Europe faces higher prices, factory shutdowns, and mass protests. One German auto executive whispers that if Chinese batteries are blocked, no electric cars can be shipped this year. In Paris, retail chains quietly warn of 15% price hikes on textiles and electronics. Leaders understand the risk. Inflation has already toppled governments before. Could they really survive another storm? Trump insists NATO must act in unity, but for Europe, the demand feels less like strategy and more like economic suicide. Beijing did not wait long to answer Trump's push in Brussels. Within hours, China announced a $50 billion trade strike on Mexico, hitting cars, steel, and textiles in one sweeping move. The shock was immediate. Mexico had become China's largest car market in the Americas, selling more than 280,000 vehicles in just 6 months. Now, dealerships in Mexico City shut their doors, complaining that even at half price, no one can afford Chinese cars after tariffs. Steel factories struggle as shipments dry up, and textile importers warn of empty shelves. Chinese officials make the message clear: obey Washington and you pay the price. They hint that the next target could be Mexico's agricultural exports, avocados and pork that China buys in huge amounts. For farmers in Michoacan, the risk feels life-threatening because local markets cannot absorb that much produce. At the same time, China begins shifting investments away from Mexico. Green energy projects once promised for solar and battery plants are quietly redirected to Brazil and Chile. For Mexican workers, that means thousands of jobs vanishing overnight. Business chambers warn that siding with Washington could cost billions in lost investment, but leaders cling to trade privileges under the USMCA. The dilemma is brutal: anger Beijing or risk Washington's wrath. Either way, Mexico is caught in the crossfire of a global economic war. For decades, American farmers proudly called their land the breadbasket of the world. But today, that basket is cracking. U.S. soybean exports to China once brought in more than $34 billion a year, making China the biggest buyer of American crops. Now these shipments have collapsed to almost nothing. In Iowa and Illinois, silos stand packed with soybeans no one ordered. Farmers admit they are staring at bins full of grain they can't move. The reason is simple: China turned to Brazil. In 2024 alone, nearly 73% of China's soybean imports came from Brazilian fields, leaving American crops rotting in storage while rail cars sit idle. Chicago futures markets felt the pain with the steepest price drop since 2012, shaking Wall Street and wiping out billions in value. For small growers, the damage is personal. Families who counted on seasonal sales to cover debts are now falling behind on loans. Rural communities watch as farm equipment dealers cut hours and fertilizer suppliers cancel contracts. Even local banks warn of rising defaults if shipments don't recover. What was once a source of American leverage, food, has become a symbol of weakness. By shifting away from U.S. crops, Beijing has erased one of Washington's last pressure points, leaving farmers angry, anxious, and abandoned. While American farmers watch crops rot and Mexico struggles with tariffs, Brazil celebrates its biggest rise in decades. China has moved billions in trade towards Sao Paulo, Rio, and new ports along the Atlantic. BYD opened a new factory in Bahia, Brazil, that will begin assembling electric vehicles. Soon after, Great Wall Motors launched a second plant for pickup trucks, and Chery signed partnerships with Brazilian firms to expand assembly lines. Every factory means thousands of jobs and a stronger role for Brazil as China's hub. But the change is not just about cars. Brazil has also taken control of the soybean trade, supplying nearly 70% of China's soybean imports in recent months. New rail lines and expanded ports in Santos and Paranaguá are being built to speed exports. And in a dramatic move, China's state banks created a new clearing system with Brazil that allows direct payments in yuan. Within weeks, a third of soybean contracts were no longer priced in U.S. dollars. Analysts warn this is a tectonic shift that threatens the dollar's dominance in Latin America. For Brazil, it is opportunity. For Washington, it is disaster. Each diverted shipment, each new contract, pulls China closer to Brazil and pushes America further to the sidelines. Europe now finds itself trapped between Trump's demands and Beijing's threats. In Berlin, auto chiefs warn that without Chinese batteries, German factories cannot finish electric cars. Assembly lines stand at risk of stopping, leaving thousands of workers in fear of layoffs. In Paris, supermarket chains quietly warn that if Chinese textiles and electronics disappear, prices will rise by 15% or more. Families already struggling with bills could face new waves of anger. Italy reports that its textile sector depends heavily on Chinese imports, and shortages would arrive within weeks. Southern European countries warn that obeying Washington's plan could mean economic suicide. EU officials calculate that the EU ran a trade deficit with China of $305.8 billion in 2024, showing just how deep the dependency runs. For leaders already shaken by energy crises and farmer protests, another shock could topple fragile governments. The streets of Europe have seen unrest before, and leaders know how fast it can return. Germany also remains heavily reliant on China for key imports like solar panels and batteries, vital for its green transition. Behind closed doors, finance ministers debate quietly if loyalty to NATO is worth destroying their own economies. For Germany, France, and Italy, the choice is brutal. Either they align with Trump and risk collapse at home, or they resist and watch Washington's anger grow. Europe is stuck in the middle, torn between survival and obedience. While Washington talks about tariffs, Beijing quietly prepares weapons that need no armies. One of them is rare earth minerals, the metals used in missiles, fighter jets, smartphones, and wind turbines. China controls about 60 to 70% of global rare earth mining and well over 90% of processing capacity. EU officials admit replacing that source could take years. A sudden cut would cripple Europe's defense industries and delay green energy projects across Germany and France. At the same time, Beijing hints at another move, its massive holdings of U.S. treasuries. China is America's second largest foreign creditor, with more than $700 billion in U.S. debt. Verified approximations in government data and widely reported in financial press. Even a small reduction could send shockwaves through global markets. Bond traders already nervous about high interest rates warn that if China sells, yields could hit levels not seen in decades. A strategist at J.P. Morgan puts it simply: if Beijing trims holdings by just 5%, U.S. borrowing costs could soar to a generational high. For Washington, this is the nightmare, facing a rival that can strike through markets, not missiles. For Beijing, it is leverage that requires no bullets, only patience. Rare earths and treasuries, two silent weapons strong enough to rattle America's economy without firing a single shot. Washington demanded NATO sanction China, but Beijing's $50 billion shock on Mexico shows who truly holds the power. Subscribe now for more breaking analysis, because this battle is only beginning, and America may already be losing.